Let's continue to move the show forward here, and we want to continue with our ongoing coverage of the genocide in Gaza and the overarching ethnic cleansing being conducted on a daily basis against Palestinians all across the region. We are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Yara Shoufani, who is a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Yara, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here on the show. One of the big topics in the media, at least in the United States, as it concerns what's happening in Gaza, is this, sort of, I don't even know what to call it, theater being made around humanitarian aid, people building piers, people airdropping different things. I mean, I guess my question for you is, do you think any of this has any level of sincerity to it at all, or is it really just its own, part of the broader sort of smokescreen being laid down by those who really want to keep supporting the genocide?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is theater. I think political theater. There's a few ways I think to look at this. First of all, Biden dropping humanitarian aid is taking place alongside the sending of weapons to Israel, right? Alongside the continued support of Israel's genocide. And so, what's embedded really in this idea is that Israel can continue to drop U.S. bombs onto Gaza while the United States sends in small amounts of aid in order to largely appease and quell the mass movements that are taking place inside the United States that correctly see that the United States is a partner in this genocide. I think what's also important to note here is the aid situation on the ground itself. We're looking at a population of 2.3 million Palestinians that are trapped inside Gaza. Hundreds of thousands are experiencing starvation. And we are seeing really intentional famine that's being created. And the United States has provided, I think, to date, just over 10,000 meals and have actually killed Palestinians through the process of aid delivery. So we know that Palestinians have been crushed by the dropping of aid, but we also know that Israel has massacred Palestinians who are collecting aid. We just saw a few weeks ago with what's been dubbed the Flower Massacre that took place, where Palestinians who were rushing to collect aid were deliberately targeted and killed. And that massacre is not unique. There have been many massacres that have followed where the targeting of Palestinians collecting aid has taken place. And so I think what we need to really remember here is this question of what role does starvation play for the Israelis? Because this famine that's taking place in Gaza is not natural, it's by design. Israel is not allowing aid in. I think most of us have probably seen videos of settlers, Zionist settlers, who have, physically been protesting to stop aid from entering. And so we know Israel doesn't want to allow aid in. And the reason that Israel doesn't want to allow aid in is that by creating mass starvation inside Gaza, Israel can raise the bargaining ceiling and use starvation and aid as a negotiation strategy. They know that Palestinians in Gaza are starving, but they also know that the people of Gaza have consistently supported the Palestinian right to resist. And so by creating starvation, Israel is trying to create dissent within Gaza against the Palestinian right to resist. And so this is a deliberate tactic. And I think we need to understand the discussion around this temporary pier that the U.S. is saying that it's going to construct. First of all, I think it needs to be understood along two ways. One is this kind of political theater that I mentioned earlier, right? Biden is in an election year. He's facing significant pressure from the masses of people who are out on the streets every single week. Some every single day across US cities. And Biden is trying to kind of obfuscate or cloud the US's role in this genocide. But also, I think there's the other reality, which is that the pier, which is, will take months to construct, is likely also a security related project in order to prepare for a post-war situation. We know that through U.S. intelligence reports that the United States does not think that Israel is going to be able to successfully, destroy any resistance factions within Gaza. And so, the United States and Israel are in many ways trying to prepare for what a post-war situation is going to look like. And I think that it's important for us to think about the pier in relation to that. We know that Israel has flattened land and created corridors for a possible long-term occupation of Gaza to create a regime of control within Gaza. And the pier is likely, the hopes are for the US that the pier would serve a similar function. And so I think with all of that laid out in front of us, I think we need to understand this political theater around aid and the pier, both as a attempt by the United States to quell dissent within its own nation, but also as a preparation for a post-war situation.
Yeah, I think that's really well explained. And, related to that, there's all this discussion about a potential ceasefire. I mean, it's kind of all we've been hearing the last couple of months without any actual ceasefire taking place. The White House keeps saying that a deal is on the table, but then they'll also say it's just up to the resistance to accept it. It's all Hamas's fault. They just won't accept the ceasefire deal that we're trying to push. What do we know about the state of these negotiations and this so-called deal?
I mean, I think first of all, it's, of course, on the topic of political theater, this is part of the political theater of the United States, the nation that has now vetoed multiple ceasefire resolutions at the United Nations to turn around and sort of blame the Palestinian resistance for the fact that there is no ceasefire. But I think it's also important to understand that for the Palestinian resistance and for Hamas specifically, they have reiterated time and time again that they will accept a deal which includes really three central components. One is a permanent ceasefire, so not a 6-week pause to a genocide. The second is a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And the third is a prisoner exchange. We know that for the Palestinian resistance factions, they are concerned with the question of prisoners, that there are thousands of prisoners in Israeli prisons. And so this is also part of the demands that we've seen within Hamas's proposed deals. And it's clear from the back and forth, and for those of us who've been following the different proposed deals that have been on the table, quote unquote, that there have been back and forth discussions where Israel will try to propose a specific kind of deal and Hamas will oppose or push for particular amendments that Israel will not agree to. And it's been really clear that Hamas is not going to accept a pause to genocide. But with that said, we've now also seen increased pressure over the last few weeks for there to be a deal. We saw Biden pushing for a deal before Ramadan, but we also saw reports just this past weekend of Qatar trying to pressure Hamas to strike a deal by threatening to deport Hamas political leadership from Qatar if they don't agree to a deal. And so there's been all kinds of pressure from all sides in order to get a deal on the table. But I think it's important here for us to consider the position of the Palestinian resistance. I mentioned earlier a U.S. intelligence report, which named that it's clear that Israel will not achieve its stated goals of defeating Palestinian forces in Gaza. But in addition to that, this same U.S. intelligence report also notes that the Israeli government is on the brink of collapse. We know that there is a really kind of fragile arrangement between the more liberal segment of Israeli society and Israel's political class, and some of its more fanatic, fascistic settler elements. And the war that Lebanon opened on the south, at the southern front, has created significant pressure on the Israeli government because of the Lebanese resistance ability to push Israeli settlers from the north out of the north due to the bombardment and the back and forth between Lebanon and the Zionist entity. And so all of these are creating internal contradictions within the Israeli state. And to add to that is the fact that the continued threats to invade Rafah by Israel have continuously been delayed. And part of that is because of Israel's military losses that have taken place inside Gaza. And so these kinds of conditions, suggest that Israel is really desperate for some kind of deal that will allow for the hostages to be returned to Israel, because the Israeli government needs some kind of political victory on the release of the hostages in order to show its population that actually this is a government that is functioning and that can continue to rule. And I think Hamas is aware of that. The different forces that comprise of the resistance axis or the axis of resistance are aware of that and have been involved in intensifying pressure to create and further agitate these internal contradictions. And Hamas has continued to be clear that without a ceasefire, they will not accept a deal that results in just a pause to a genocide.
Well, Yara, one of the other things that I think is also happening and not getting as much attention is there seems that in the West Bank there is also continued escalation of all sorts of activities, around the occupation, ethnic cleansing, settlement building, and so on and so forth. What do we know about the situation there in the West Bank currently?
So I think that's really important for us to talk a little bit about the West Bank, especially because the situation in the West Bank is rapidly shifting. For the last couple of months, we've seen escalations take place in the West Bank by the Zionist entity of Israel. Namely mass incarcerations. The number of Palestinians that are being detained by Israel has been rising steadily over the last couple of months. And we've also seen significant raids on parts of the West Bank. In particular, one area that's been raided quite consistently is Jenin Camp. We've seen the Zionist occupation forces enter Jenin Camp and attack Jenin Camp repeatedly. And I think the reason that the West Bank is so critical in this particular moment actually is that we have now entered the holy month of Ramadan. And what's interesting to note is that just a few weeks ago, Biden actually stated that the United States is pushing for a ceasefire before Ramadan, and named that the reason for that is because the United States was concerned that if this situation continues into Ramadan, there could be a really dangerous situation for Israel and for Jerusalem in particular. And the reason for that is because Ramadan always brings with it heightened tensions and heightened consciousness. Palestinians, we've seen time and time again during Ramadan tensions unfold within Jerusalem and the West Bank. That Israeli settlers oftentimes attack Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. And in 2021 in particular, we saw tensions rise during Ramadan as Zionist settlers were both seeking to colonize Sheikh Jarrah, but also were entering the compound of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and threatening Palestinian worshippers in the mosque. And it was during this period in 2021 that we saw the start to the Battle of Saif al-Quds, where the Palestinian resistance was victorious in a battle against Israel's onslaught, and asserted actually in this period to Israel that the deterrence equation that had been established, which was sort of a quiet for quiet equation, applied not only to Gaza, but actually extended to the West Bank and Jerusalem. And it was during this period that we saw really the heightened support for the path of armed struggle across all of Palestine. And we've already seen, actually, just in the last few days, a surge in resistance operations taking place in the West Bank. We know that the conditions inside the West Bank are quite challenging for, resistance in general. There are, of course, all across the West Bank settlements. There is a apartheid wall. There are checkpoints. And so it is a very difficult terrain. But we also know that during this period, there is a oftentimes surge in individual and small unit resistance operations that take place in the West Bank. And so it's a critical place for us to continue to monitor over the next couple of weeks, as up until now, we've largely seen the West Bank be extremely constrained in its ability to, partake in this war. We know that Israel is fighting a war on multiple fronts, both with Gaza, but also with South Lebanon and Hezbollah, as well as Ansar Allah and Yemen's entrance into the war. And so it's clear that there's concern by the United States and by Israel of the possibility of escalations to take place in the West Bank as well.
Yeah, I also wanted to add on to this before we wrap up here. What would you say is the state of the worldwide movement in solidarity with Palestine? It seems like it's continuing to grow and expand despite, of course, like what the Israelis would have wanted, which I'm sure by now they wanted everybody to just have given up and gotten tired and forgotten. But the idea of of this movement having grown and expanded, how accurate is that picture, do you think?
I think that it's really it's a situation. The situation that we're in is one of two truths, right? On the one hand, you have the savagery and just sheer violence of the Zionist genocide on Gaza, and on the other hand, you have the raising of consciousness all across the world and the building of a mass movement in support for Palestine. And I think that this mass movement is really at a critical stage. We have seen this mass movement grow, but we have also seen this mass movement diversify in tactics. Just yesterday, activists in the United States, shut down airports, both in California, as well as protests in Cleveland around the airport. We have seen organizers just last week in Dallas, shut down an arms factory, General Motors, and we have seen just a really major increase in protests that are taking place not only in the United States but all across the global South, all across the imperial core, and this is a moment of heightened consciousness, really. And this is a moment that has the potential, or is, I would argue, creating people who are committed to the struggle long term. We saw in 2021, during a much shorter period of time, that so many Palestinian and Arab youth, but also, people who just were awakened by the moment, the Battle of Saif al-Quds, the colonization or the attacks on Sheikh Jarrah, and people who entered the movement in 2021 and have since dedicated the last 2.5 years of their lives to building political organizations capable of challenging imperialism in ways today that we couldn't 2-3 years ago. And we're seeing that kind of impact, that kind of moment at a much larger scale right now. And so we know that this is not the battle of liberation. We know that the Palestinian struggle is a struggle that has been being waged for over 100 years, and that will continue to be waged until Palestine is free. And so we also know that people who are entering political organizing in this moment are entering political organizations for the first time and are committing themselves to a long struggle in order for us to build a mass movement and continue to build a mass movement that is going to be increasingly effective in future revolutionary periods to come. And so I think that while we're seeing a major mass movement being built right now, while we're seeing the diversification of tactics inside the imperial core that is creating significant pressure on the United States government, on the Canadian government, on all across European governments, we're also, most importantly, seeing people entering the struggle that are committed to the long-term task of building long-term beyond this political moment, and who are committed to the long-term struggle that is the Palestinian national liberation struggle.
Mm-hmm. Well, Yara Shoufani from the Palestinian Youth Movement, it is always a pleasure to have you here on the Freedom Side. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.